Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the only American governor to be assassinated in office, William Goebel. Our journey begins on the morning of January 30th, 1900, in the small, riverside city of Frankfort, Kentucky. The air that morning carried a sharp, crystalline bite, the kind that settles deep into the lungs and turns every breath into a ghostly plume of white mist. It was a cold that felt ancient, rising from the dark, slow-moving waters of the Kentucky River and clinging to the limestone cliffs that cradled the town. The sky was clear, a pale, brittle blue that offered no warmth, only a stark clarity that made every brick and every leafless branch stand out with painful precision. In the streets, the lingering scent of coal smoke hung heavy, a thick, sulphurous perfume from 1,000 hearths, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of the frozen mud that crusted the cobblestones. There was a peculiar stillness to the day, an unsettling quiet that seemed to press against the ears. For days, the town had been swollen with the presence of thousands of armed men from the eastern mountains, their voices loud and their tempers short. But on this particular morning, the square felt strangely hollowed out, as if the city itself were holding its breath in anticipation of a storm that had not yet broken. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the heavy doors of the Capitol Hotel swung open with a rhythmic creak of iron and wood. Stepping out into the biting cold was William Goebel. He was a man of medium height, but possessed a presence that seemed to fill the space around him, dressed in a heavy, dark wool overcoat that reached down past his knees. His footsteps were deliberate, the sound of his leather soles striking the pavement in a steady, confident cadence. To his left walked Colonel Jack Chin, and to his right, Captain F. Lillard, the warden of the state penitentiary. Their breath rose in synchronized puffs as they moved briskly toward the old state capitol. Goebel's gloved hands were tucked into his pockets, and his gaze was fixed forward, toward the limestone facade of the building where his political fate hung in the balance. The walk was familiar, a route he had taken many times, yet today the texture of the air felt different. Every sound, the distant clip-clop of a horse's hooves, the faint rustle of a dry leaf skittering across the sidewalk, seemed amplified in the eerie vacancy of the grounds. Usually, the plaza would be teeming with lobbyists and spectators, but today, the brick walkway lay open and inviting, a narrow ribbon of red leading toward the seat of power. As they approached the wrought iron gates of the Capitol grounds, Goebel turned slightly to his companions. There was a momentary softening of his usually stern features, a flicker of relief that the morning's tension had not yet erupted into the violence many had feared. He remarked to Lillard and Chin that he felt he could breathe a little easier now. They were only about 200 feet from the main entrance of the building, the broad stone steps rising up like a monument in the center of the square. To their right stood the executive building, a 3-story structure of imposing brick that housed the offices of the Secretary of State and the governor. The windows of the building looked down like silent, unblinking eyes. One particular window on the first floor was open just a few inches at the bottom, its dark curtain drawn low, a small, black gap in the uniform glass. The sun caught the edges of the frosted panes, creating a shimmering glare that made it difficult to see into the shadows of the rooms within. Goebel and his companions continued their stride, their shadows stretching long and thin across the frozen grass, unaware that from within that sliver of darkness, a rifle barrel was being carefully leveled, the cold steel steady against the wood of the window frame. The silence was shattered by a sound so sharp and sudden that it felt more like a physical blow than a noise. A single rifle shot rang out, echoing off the surrounding brick walls and sending a murder of crows into the sky, their black wings flapping frantically against the pale blue. In that instant, time seemed to slow, the world contracting into the space between heartbeats. Goebel let out an involuntary exclamation of pain, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the cold air. He stumbled, his hand reaching instinctively for his right breast, his fingers clutching at the thick wool of his coat as he tried to grasp the source of the sudden, searing heat. A puff of white smoke drifted lazily from the window of the executive building, hanging for a heartbeat in the still air like a ghost. Goebel's strength began to drain away as if the very ground were pulling at him. He attempted to reach for the revolver in his pocket, a final, defiant gesture of the fighter he had always been, but his knees buckled. The world tilted, the horizon spinning as he sank to the sidewalk, his body heavy and unresponsive. The cold bricks felt unforgiving beneath him as he collapsed, the bright, vivid red of his blood beginning to bloom against the dark fabric of his clothing, spreading like a shadow in the morning light. The chaos that followed was a blur of frantic voices and heavy footfalls. Jack Chin, seeing his friend slump to the side, lunged forward to catch him, his own voice thick with shock and desperation. He cried out, "My God, Goebel, they have killed you." He urged the fallen man to lie still, his hands pressing against Goebel's shoulders to keep him down, fearful that more shots would follow from the hidden vantage point in the building above. "Lie down, Senator," he pleaded. "Don't get up, those murderers will shoot you again." F. Lillard turned back, his face a mask of horror as he assisted Chin in rolling the wounded man onto his back. Goebel's eyes were open, staring up at the vast, empty sky, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Within moments, the vacancy of the square disappeared, replaced by a surge of people pouring out from the nearby buildings, drawn by the echo of the gunfire. The air was no longer silent. It was filled with the shouts of men, the clatter of boots on stone, and the distant ringing of an alarm. A group of men moved forward, their faces pale and drawn, to lift the senator from the ground. They worked with a frantic, clumsy grace, their hands trembling as they bore the weight of the man who would be governor, carrying him back toward the Capitol Hotel through a gauntlet of weeping onlookers and rising fury. They carried him into the hotel lobby, the smell of wood smoke and expensive tobacco replaced by the metallic tang of blood and the sterile scent of the doctor's bag. Dr. Hume was already waiting, his office located conveniently within the hotel, but the room quickly became a stifling press of curious faces and grieving supporters. Every movement was slow, every decision heavy with the realization that the bullet, a .38 caliber steel-jacketed projectile, had done its work with devastating efficiency. It had entered the right breast, shattering a rib and piercing the lung before exiting near the spine, leaving a trail of ruin through the man's body. As Goebel was laid upon a bed on the second floor, his black hat resting on his chest, the town of Frankfurt began to transform. Outside the hotel windows, the sound of the state militia's rhythmic marching began to fill the streets, the rhythmic tapping of rifle butts on the pavement providing a haunting heartbeat to the dying man's struggle. The 30th of January was only the beginning of a tragedy that would stretch into the days ahead, a time when the thin line between law and lawlessness would finally snap, leaving a state and a nation in mourning. The wooden floorboards of the Capitol Hotel groaned under the weight of the men who carried him, a rhythmic, desperate creaking that echoed against the high, vaulted ceilings. Outside, the winter air of 1900 was a sharp, biting thing, but inside, the atmosphere had turned thick and suffocating. The air was a heavy soup of wood smoke, wet wool, and the coppery, cloying sweetness of fresh blood that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains and the gilded frames of the portraits on the wall. As they laid him down, the frantic whispers of the bystanders blurred into a low, oceanic hum. To understand the bullet that had just torn through William Goebel, one must look back beyond the smoke of the rifle, into the decades of resentment that had simmered in the Kentucky soil. It was a soil still damp with the memories of the Civil War, a conflict that had never truly left the hearts of these men. Kentucky had been a state of ghosts, a borderland where brother had fought brother, and by the late 1890s, those old wounds had not healed. They had simply curdled into a new kind of political venom. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to hold the weight of a generation of men who were taught that the ballot was merely an extension of the bayonet. William Goebel was not a man built for the easy, backslapping charm of the Southern political circuit. He was the son of German immigrants, born in Pennsylvania, and he carried himself with a precision that his enemies found arrogant and his followers found intoxicating. They called him the Prussian, a nickname that carried the weight of steel and discipline. He was cold, his eyes often described as two shards of gray glass that did not so much look at you as through you. He did not drink, he did not smoke, and he did not indulge in the theatrical oratory of the era. Instead, he spoke in a low, measured monotone that commanded a room through sheer, icy will. His rise through the ranks of the Democratic Party had been fueled by a singular, burning hatred for the monopolies that strangled the state, most notably the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. To Goebel, the railroad was a leviathan, a mechanical beast that owned the legislature and the very breath of the common farmer. He positioned himself as the champion of the poor, the man who would break the iron tracks of the corporate giants. But in doing so, he became a giant of another kind, a master of the political machine who understood that power was not given. It was seized through the meticulous manipulation of the law. He moved through the world with a terrifying stillness, a man who believed that the wheels of progress required a firm, singular hand to steer them, regardless of who was crushed beneath. The true genesis of the violence lay in the ink and parchment of the 1898 election law, a piece of legislation so brazenly designed to consolidate power that it bore Goebel's name like a brand. Imagine the quiet, dusty halls of the State House as the bill was drafted, the scratching of quill pens the only sound in a room where the future of 1 million citizens was being rewritten. This law removed the power of election certification from the local counties and placed it into the hands of a 3-member board in Frankfurt, a board appointed by the legislature, which Goebel conveniently controlled. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering, a stacked deck that meant even if the people voted one way, the board could simply choose to see things another. The outcry was immediate and visceral. Across the state, from the mist-covered mountains of the east to the rolling bluegrass of the center, the sense of a stolen future began to take root. The Republicans, who had only recently tasted their first gubernatorial victory with William Bradley in 1895, saw the Goebel Law as a death knell for their party. The state was no longer debating policy. It was debating the very existence of the ballot box. Every signature on that document felt like a hammer blow against the door of democracy, and the echoing sound of that blow was beginning to wake the ghosts of old feuds. The heat of June 1899 brought with it the infamous Music Hall Convention in Louisville, a gathering that felt less like a political meeting and more like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. The hall was a cavernous space, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the sharp tang of bourbon that failed to dull the rising tempers. For days, the delegates were locked in a stalemate, 26 rounds of voting that stretched into the humid nights. The air was thick with the sound of shouting, the rhythmic thumping of canes against the floor, and the underlying threat of physical violence. Goebel, ever the tactician, used every tool at his disposal, including bribery, intimidation, and procedural trickery, to claw his way to the nomination. When he finally emerged as the candidate, he had not united his party, he had shattered it. A faction of honest election Democrats, revolted by his methods, broke away to form their own ticket, leaving the state fractured into 3 competing camps. The following campaign was a long, dark descent into mudslinging and malice. Goebel toured the state alongside the silver-tongued William Jennings Bryan, his presence a stark contrast to the populist firebrand, while the Republican nominee, William S. Taylor, warned his followers that the coils of tyranny were tightening around their necks. The very air of Kentucky seemed to vibrate with a low, dissonant frequency, the sound of a society coming apart at the seams. By the time Election Day arrived in November 1899, the atmosphere in Kentucky was brittle, like old parchment ready to tear at the slightest touch. The results were a nightmare of ambiguity. Taylor, the Republican, appeared to lead by a mere 2,383 votes, a margin so thin it was practically invisible in a sea of over 400,000 ballots. Under the Goebel law, the contest moved to the very board Goebel had created. But in a move that shocked the nation, the board initially certified Taylor as the winner, perhaps fearing the erupting violence that was already spilling into the streets. Taylor was inaugurated in December, but the victory was a hollow one. Goebel and the Democratic-controlled legislature filed a formal contest, alleging widespread fraud in dozens of counties. As the new year of 1900 dawned, Frankfort became an armed camp. Trains began to arrive from the eastern mountains, their steam whistles screaming into the frozen air, carrying hundreds of mountain men dressed in rough wool and carrying Winchester rifles. They moved through the streets like a silent, gray tide, their faces weathered and hard, their eyes fixed on the State House. They were there to protect Taylor, to ensure that the election was not handed back to Goebel. Gatling guns were positioned on the Capitol grounds, their multi-barreled silhouettes casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. It was into this landscape of ice and iron that William Goebel walked on that fateful morning, a man walking toward a crown and a grave at the very same time. The silence before the shots was not a peaceful one. It was the silence of a held breath, of a trigger squeezed halfway, of a state waiting to see if it would survive its own ambition. The transition of power in the final days of 1899 did not bring the expected peace to the bluegrass state. Instead, it felt like the slow drawing of a heavy, rusted curtain over a stage set for tragedy. On the 12th of December, William Taylor stood upon the podium, his hand resting on the leather-bound book as he was sworn in as the 33rd governor of Kentucky. The air that afternoon was a biting, hollow cold that seemed to seep through the thickest wool coats and settle in the very marrow of the bones. There were cheers, yes, but they were thin and brittle, carried away by a wind that smelled of wet slate and river mud. Taylor took his seat in the governor's office, a room filled with the scent of old mahogany and the faint, lingering aroma of his predecessor's pipe tobacco, yet the chair beneath him felt temporary, almost ghostly. Beneath the surface of the official ceremonies, a quiet, methodical machinery was grinding into motion. The Democratic-led legislature refused to look away from the narrow margin of Taylor's victory, a mere 2,383 votes that they believed were the fruit of a poisoned tree. In the dimly lit corridors of the State House, where the gas lamps flickered and hissed like whispering tongues, the talk was not of policy, but of contest. The victory was certified by the board, but in the hearts of the opposition, the election was a ghost that refused to be buried. As January of 1900 dawned, the capital city of Frankfort transformed. It was no longer a place of law, but a place of war in waiting. From the rugged, mist-shrouded peaks of eastern Kentucky, the trains began to arrive, their iron wheels screaming against the tracks as they pulled into the station. The locomotives exhaled great, billowing clouds of white steam that mingled with the black coal smoke, obscuring the faces of the men who stepped onto the platforms. They were the mountain men, hundreds upon hundreds of them, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their eyes hard and unblinking. They carried Winchesters and old hunting rifles slung over their shoulders as casually as one might carry a walking stick. They arrived by the order of those who feared the legislature would steal the seat from Taylor. And as they marched through the streets of Frankfort, the rhythmic thud of their heavy boots on the cobblestones sounded like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. The air in the town grew thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of oiled gun barrels. Residents watched from behind heavy velvet curtains, the silence in the streets broken only by the low, guttural murmur of armed partisans gathered around flickering campfires. The State House grounds were no longer a garden of civic pride, but a fortress, bristling with the silhouettes of men who were prepared to defend a vote with lead and fire. The legislative session began in an atmosphere of suffocating tension. Inside the chambers, the air was warm and stale, smelling of sweat and floor wax, while outside, the frost climbed the window panes in jagged, crystalline patterns. Two separate bodies claimed the right to govern, and two men now looked upon the same golden dome with a sense of destiny that could only end in a collision. William Goebel, ever the iron-willed strategist, moved through this landscape with a chilling composure. He knew the risks. He had seen the letters, the scrawled threats of violence that arrived in the morning mail, smelling of cheap ink and anger. Yet he continued to walk the path to the State House every morning. The path was a familiar one, a stretch of pavement that led past the shadows of the executive buildings. On the morning of January 30th, the sky was a flat, featureless gray, the color of a lead bullet. Goebel walked alongside Jack Chin and F. Lillard, their breath blooming in the air like small, fading ghosts. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the crunch of frozen slush beneath their feet and the distant, rhythmic panting of a switch engine in the rail yard. As they approached the gates of the Capitol, the stillness was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pregnant silence that precedes a lightning strike. Then the silence shattered. A single, sharp crack rang out, echoing off the stone walls of the State House like a whip across water. It came from the direction of the executive building, from a window draped in shadow. Goebel did not scream. He simply stopped, his body jolting as if he had been struck by an invisible hand. A second shot followed, then another, the reports overlapping in a chaotic, deafening rhythm. Goebel crumpled, his knees hitting the cold, hard ground first, before he slumped forward onto the pavement. The blood was a startling, vivid crimson against the dull gray stone, a spreading stain that seemed to pulse with the fading rhythm of his heart. Panic erupted, a cacophony of shouting and the frantic scraping of boots as men scrambled for cover. Jack Chin knelt beside him, his voice a frantic whisper against the rising noise of the crowd, urging Goebel to stay down, to stay still. The air was suddenly sharp with the smell of burnt gunpowder, a bitter, acrid scent that hung in the frigid morning mist. Goebel's eyes, usually so sharp and piercing, grew clouded, fixed on a sky that offered no answers. They carried him away, leaving behind only the dark, cooling traces of the violence on the walkway, while the shadow in the window vanished back into the depths of the building. In a dimly lit room on the second floor of the Capitol Hotel, the air was thick with the scent of ether, blood, and the wax of many candles. William Goebel lay amidst the white sheets, his face as pale as the linen beneath him, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound that filled the small space. Outside, the world was descending into madness. Governor Taylor, hearing the echoes of the shots, had declared a state of insurrection, calling upon the militia to surround the Capitol and barring the legislature from meeting. He ordered them to move to London, Kentucky, a Republican stronghold, but the Democrats refused to budge. They met in secret, in the shadows of the hotel, their voices hushed and urgent. While the State Guard stood with fixed bayonets in the streets, a committee moved with desperate speed. On the 31st of January, 1900, as the sun struggled to pierce the winter fog, they brought the papers to Goebel's bedside. With a hand that trembled with the weight of his final moments, the wounded man took the oath. In that small, stifling room, Kentucky gained a second governor. Goebel's first and only official act was a whispered command to disband the very militia that held the city in its grip. It was a paradox of power. A man whose life was flickering out like a guttering candle was now the highest authority in a state that was tearing itself apart. Frankfurt was now a city divided by more than just politics. It was a city divided by two souls. One governor sat in the executive mansion, surrounded by armed men and the cold machinery of the state guard, while the other lay in a hotel room 2 blocks away, his life draining into the very fabric of the bed. The legislative halls were empty, their tall doors locked and guarded by soldiers who did not know whose orders to follow. The very air seemed to vibrate with the threat of a second civil war, a conflict that would pit neighbor against neighbor over the legitimacy of a signature on a piece of parchment. In the surrounding counties, men cleaned their rifles by the light of hearth fires, waiting for the word to march. The legal battle began to churn in the background, a storm of injunctions and appeals that moved far slower than the pulsing fever in Goebel's chest. As night fell over the capital, the flickering lights of the campfires reflected in the dark waters of the Kentucky River, and the state stood on a precipice so narrow that a single breath could send it tumbling into the abyss. There was no sleep for the city, only the long, cold watch of men waiting for the dawn, or for the final breath of the man in the Capitol Hotel. The Capitol Hotel stood as a monolith of uneasy sanctuary amidst the freezing winds of Frankfurt. Inside room number 7, the air was thick, heavy with the sharp, medicinal tang of ether and the cloying sweetness of various balms. The heavy velvet curtains, a deep and somber shade of crimson, were drawn tightly against the world. Yet they could not fully block out the rhythmic, hollow clip-clop of cavalry horses patrolling the cobblestones below. William Goebel lay amidst a sea of white linens, his frame appearing smaller and more fragile than it ever had in the halls of the Senate. The light in the room was dim, provided only by a few flickering candles and the low orange glow of the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to climb the walls like silent spectators. More than 18 physicians moved through the suite with hushed footsteps, their leather soles creaking softly on the polished hardwood floors. They spoke in low, rhythmic murmurs, a symphony of clinical concern that filled the pauses between Goebel's shallow, ragged breaths. Each inhalation was a labor, a visible struggle that pulled at the fabric of his nightshirt, which was stained with the faint, persistent yellow of antiseptic. Outside the door, the hallway was a gauntlet of anxious allies and silent guards, their faces etched with the strain of a city teetering on the edge of a precipice. The atmosphere was one of suspended animation, as if the very clock on the mantelpiece was hesitant to tick forward into an uncertain future. While the wounded man drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, a secret drama was unfolding within the hotel's hidden corners. The Democratic members of the legislature, barred from their rightful seats in the state house by the glinting bayonets of the militia, gathered in hushed desperation. They met in a crowded room where the scent of cigar smoke and wet wool hung in the air, their voices barely rising above a whisper for fear of discovery. It was here, on the afternoon of the 31st of January, 1900, that the contest committee reached its final, momentous decision. They moved through the legal proceedings with a solemnity that felt more like a ritual than a political act. Paper rustled softly as signatures were gathered, the scratch of fountain pens the only sound in the tense silence. They declared that William Goebel had indeed received the highest number of legal votes and was, by right of law, the 34th governor of Kentucky. The gravity of the moment settled over the men like a heavy shroud. They were crowning a man who was walking through the valley of the shadow. There was no cheering, no celebratory toast. There was only the weight of the document and the knowledge that they must now carry it to the bedside of a dying man to seal the fate of the Commonwealth. The door to the sick room opened with a slow, agonizing groan of brass hinges. Chief Justice James Hazelrig entered, his face a mask of judicial poise despite the visible tremor in the air. He approached the bed where Goebel lay, his eyes barely open, reflecting the guttering candlelight. A physician leaned down, whispering softly into the governor-elect's ear, explaining the purpose of the gathering. It was then that Goebel performed what those present would later describe as a superhuman effort of will. With the help of strong hands supporting his shoulders, He forced his body to rise, sitting up against the pillows. The movement was slow and clearly agonizing. The sheets rustled sharply as he shifted his weight. His right hand, pale and thin, rose slowly into the cool air of the room. The Chief Justice began to recite the oath of office, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet, resonant power that seemed to vibrate against the stillness. Goebel's response was a mere thread of sound, a ghost of the voice that had once thundered through political rallies, yet the words were clear enough to be recorded by history. In that moment, the room felt as though it were at the very center of the universe. The simple act of swearing to protect the Constitution became a bridge between life and whatever lay beyond. When the oath was finished, Goebel sank back into the mattress, his chest heaving, the effort having claimed nearly all the strength he had left. Even as a governor in name, the reality of power was a fleeting shadow. His first official act was a stroke of the pen, a proclamation ordering the militia to disband and the legislature to reassemble. The paper was brought to his bedside, the ink dark and wet against the cream-colored parchment. Goebel's signature was a jagged, desperate script, a visual echo of his internal struggle. Yet outside the hotel walls, the world remained unchanged. The militia, loyal to the man in the executive mansion across the way, ignored the order entirely. For a few surreal days, Kentucky existed in a state of dual reality. There were 2 governors, 2 sets of orders, and 2 armies waiting for the first sign of a breakdown. The Capitol Hotel became a fortress of the dying, while the State House remained a fortress of the defiant. Inside the sick room, the passage of time became blurred. The transition from the 1st of February to the 2nd was marked only by the changing light against the window panes and the periodic arrival of fresh basins of warm water. The physicians worked in shifts, their faces growing haggard under the strain of a battle they knew they could not win. They listened to the governor's heart, a faint and erratic rhythm that was slowing with every passing hour, like a clock whose mainspring had finally reached its limit. By the evening of February 3rd, the end was no longer a question of if, but when. The fever had receded, leaving behind a cold, waxen clarity. Goebel was remarkably calm, his eyes tracing the patterns of the shadows on the ceiling. At one point, seeking to soothe the dryness in his throat, a physician offered him a small piece of peppermint candy. It was a simple, mundane thing, a sharp contrast to the monumental political storm raging outside. Goebel accepted it, the scent of mint momentarily cutting through the heavy smell of medicine. He turned to the doctor, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He murmured softly that it was a good piece of candy. These were among his final words, a gentle, human remark from a man who had spent his life in the furnace of public conflict. As the sun began to set over the Kentucky River, casting a bruised purple light over the city, his breathing slowed to a rhythmic, peaceful sigh. The physicians stood back, their instruments put away, their roles now reduced to those of witnesses. At exactly 6:44 in the evening, the struggle ended. The air in the room seemed to settle, the tension that had held the hotel in its grip for days finally snapping into a profound, ringing silence. William Goebel was gone, leaving behind a legacy that would be etched in blood and controversy for generations to come. The news of his passing rippled outward from the Capitol Hotel like a stone dropped into a still pond. The clip-clop of the horses stopped as the riders heard the word. In the corridors, men removed their hats and bowed their heads, the weight of the moment pressing down on every shoulder. William Goebel had served as the governor of Kentucky for only 4 days, a tenure marked entirely by the proximity of death. He was the first, and remains the only American governor to be assassinated while in office. The stillness that followed was not one of peace, but of a deep, collective breath being held. The city of Frankfort sat in the dark, the snow beginning to fall once more, covering the cobblestones and the silent cannons in a soft, white shroud. The man who had sought to change the world with his laws and his will was now a part of the earth he had fought so hard to lead. The candles in room number 7 were extinguished one by one, until only the faint, dying embers in the hearth remained, glowing like the last coal of a fire that had burned far too bright and far too fast. The political machinery would continue to grind, and the search for the hand that pulled the trigger would consume the years to follow. But in this moment, there was only the cold, winter night and the final, heavy silence of the governor's room. The air around the executive building remained heavy, a thick, stagnant fog that seemed to cling to the rough-hewn stone of the facade. Detectives and surveyors stood in the courtyard, their breath blooming in white clouds against the January chill. They were not looking at the ground where the struggle had occurred, but upward, their eyes tracing the lines of the 3-story structure with a grim, rhythmic focus. Their attention was held captive by a single, unremarkable opening on the first floor, a window belonging to the office of the Secretary of State. Behind that glass, the world was silent, yet the investigators could feel the weight of what had occurred there. They measured angles with a painstaking slowness, their wooden rulers clicking softly as they mapped the trajectory of a single piece of lead. The lead had traveled from that dark interior, through the freezing air, to find its mark. It was a mathematical puzzle of bone and ballistics, a quiet geometry of death that pointed its finger directly at the room where Caleb Powers held his authority. The investigators moved with a hushed reverence, their boots crunching on the frozen earth, as they realized that the most dangerous place in Frankfurt that morning had not been the open street, but the shadows behind a pane of glass. Inside the office of Caleb Powers, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper, leather-bound ledgers, and the faint, metallic tang of rifle oil. The mahogany desk sat heavily in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with political leaflets and half-finished letters that now seemed like relics of a lost world. Light filtered through the tall, narrow window on the north side, illuminating the slow dance of dust motes in the air. This was the space where the mechanics of power were usually practiced with pens and stamps, yet now it felt like a hollowed-out shell. Investigators discovered a spent cartridge nestled in a corner, a tiny brass cylinder that gleamed like a secret. They noted the way the window had been left just slightly ajar, allowing the winter wind to whistle a low, mournful tune against the latch. It was a room caught between states, a workspace transformed into a sniper's nest. A clerk named Henry Utzi had been seen here, his hands supposedly trembling as he handled a firearm in the days leading up to the chaos. The silence of the office was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds of an investigation that would soon tear the state apart. As the evidence began to crystallize, a frantic energy seized the Republican leadership. Caleb Powers, sensing the tightening of the legal noose, did not wait for the knock on his door. He moved through the back alleys of Frankfurt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sought the anonymity of the railroad, boarding a train bound for Lexington while cloaked in a disguise that felt like a second, tighter skin. The rhythmic chugging of the locomotive offered a temporary sanctuary, a mechanical pulse that masked the sound of his own heavy breathing. He watched the Kentucky landscape blur past the window, the rolling hills and naked trees appearing as ghosts in the twilight. But the law moved with a different kind of momentum. In Lexington, the sheriff was waiting. When the iron wheels finally ground to a screeching halt, the air on the platform was biting and sharp. Powers was apprehended, his flight ending not in a clean escape, but in the cold grip of iron handcuffs. The news of his arrest rippled through the telegraph wires, a series of sharp, electric taps that signaled the beginning of a legal odyssey that would last for nearly 10 long years. The trials that followed were not merely legal proceedings. They were grand, theatrical struggles held in the sweltering heat of the Georgetown courthouse. During those long summer months, The air inside the courtroom grew thick and humid, smelling of floor wax, sweat, and the heavy wool of three-piece suits. Large wooden fans turned lazily overhead, their rhythmic creaking providing a hypnotic backdrop to the heated arguments of the lawyers. The benches were packed with spectators, their faces flushed, their eyes darting between the defendant and the witness stand. Caleb Powers sat as still as a statue, his expression a mask of practiced indifference, while the prosecution wove a complex web of conspiracy. They spoke of secret meetings in the dead of night and the quiet exchange of money. Witnesses were brought forward like shadows from a dream, their testimonies often contradictory and fueled by partisan fire. There were whispers of juries being carefully selected to ensure a specific outcome, with Democrats and Republicans fighting for every inch of influence. The legal maneuvering was a slow, deliberate grind, a process that saw convictions handed down only to be overturned by higher courts, over and over again, like a tide that refused to settle. Deep within the machinery of the trial lay the enigmatic figure of Henry Utsi, the clerk whose testimony became a cornerstone of the mystery. He was a man of shifting loyalties and fragile nerves, at one point appearing in court strapped to a cot, his mind seemingly fractured by the weight of the accusations. He spoke of Jim Howard, a man whispered to be the true gunman, arriving in Frankfurt with a purpose that was as sharp as a bayonet. The stories told of $1,600 changing hands, a sum that felt enormous in the quiet desperation of the era. The defense countered with their own tales of bribery and intimidation, suggesting that the entire investigation was a hollow play act designed to destroy the Republican Party. Hidden witnesses emerged from the woodwork, their voices low and fearful as they recounted seeing armed men in the corridors of the executive building. Every day, the newspapers were filled with columns of tiny, dense print, detailing every sigh and every objection. The people of Kentucky read these accounts by the soft glow of oil lamps, their hearts heavy with the realization that the truth was becoming more elusive with every passing year. The trial was a labyrinth with no clear exit, a path paved with the echoes of a shot that no one could ever truly take back. As the years stretched into a full decade, the initial fire of the investigation began to fade into a long, low simmer. The political landscape of Kentucky shifted like sand beneath the feet of the accused. Caleb Powers underwent 4 separate trials, a marathon of legal endurance that saw him move between prison cells and courtroom docks until the very concept of justice felt exhausted. The once sharp details of that January morning became blurred by time and the endless repetition of testimony. By 1908, the world had begun to turn its attention toward new conflicts and different leaders. A new governor eventually issued a pardon for Powers and several others, a gesture meant to heal a state that had been bleeding from a self-inflicted wound for too long. Henry Utsi remained behind bars for nearly 18 years, a solitary figure who carried the secrets of the window within him until his release. The executive building still stood, its stones weathered by the rain and wind, its windows reflecting the changing seasons. The conspiracy theories remained, woven into the fabric of the town like a dark thread in a familiar tapestry. The pursuit of the truth had been long and weary, leaving behind a trail of paper and broken lives, while the ghost of William Goebel continued to haunt the halls of power, a reminder of the day when the music of the Capitol was silenced by a single, hidden hand. The great pendulum of justice, which had swung with such frantic, jagged motion for nearly 10 years, began at last to settle into a heavy, rhythmic stillness. The year was 1908, and the fierce political fires that had once threatened to incinerate the very foundations of the Kentucky Capitol had cooled into a low, gray ash. In the quiet courtrooms of Georgetown and Frankfurt, the thick smell of old parchment and floor wax hung in the air, a stark contrast to the gunpowder and shouting of a decade prior. Caleb Powers, the man whose name had been etched into the center of the conspiracy, stood for the fourth time within the familiar wood-paneled walls of the dock. The brass hardware of the heavy oak doors had grown tarnished by the touch of countless hands, and the dust motes danced in the long, slanted beams of the afternoon sun, oblivious to the weight of the moment. After 3 trials that had resulted in life sentences and even a death penalty, all of which were overturned by higher courts, the 4th trial ended in the hollow, echoing silence of a hung jury. It was on the 13th day of June, in 1908, that the scratch of a fountain pen across thick paper finally brought the legal saga to its knees. Governor Augustus Wilson, a man who sought to heal the state's deep, weeping wounds, pressed his seal onto a formal pardon. The ink was dark and wet, soaking slowly into the fibers of the document, signaling the end of 8 long years of imprisonment for the former Secretary of State. Powers walked out into the humid Kentucky air, a free man, eventually finding his way to the halls of Congress where he would serve for many years, though the shadow of the assassination would always follow him like a silent, persistent ghost. While the world outside moved forward into a new century of machines and progress, 2 men remained behind the thick, weeping stone walls of the state penitentiary. James Howard, the man accused of pulling the trigger from that fateful window, had faced his own gauntlet of trials and convictions, yet he too was granted his freedom by Governor Wilson on that same summer day in 1908. But for Henry Utsi, the young clerk who had held the keys and the secrets of the office, the path to release was much longer and far more solitary. Inside the cool, damp corridors of the prison, Utsi found a different kind of sanctuary. For 18 long years, he lived within a cell where the only music was the rhythmic drip of water against stone and the distant, muffled chime of the town clock. He became a man of faith, a volunteer chaplain who walked the gray halls offering comfort to those even more lost than himself. It was not until the year 1919, as the world was reeling from the end of a great global war, that the iron gates finally groaned open for him. Pardoned by Governor James Black, Utsi stepped out into a world he no longer recognized, leaving behind the heavy silence of the stone to spend his final decades in quiet reflection in his home of Newport. The political fury that had once demanded his life had evaporated, replaced by the soft, sweeping wind of the passing years, until he finally found rest in 1942. And what of the man who fled? William Taylor, the deposed governor who had watched his power slip away in the smoke of a rifle shot, remained in exile in the city of Indianapolis. For him, the hills of Kentucky were a forbidden landscape, a jagged horizon he could see but never touch. Though he was pardoned in 1909, the fear of the old animosities kept him across the river, a man living in a self-imposed shadow. He practiced law and lived a quiet life, but the vibrant, chaotic world of Frankfurt politics was forever closed to him. Back at the site of the tragedy, the old Capitol grounds began to undergo a transformation. In 1910, a massive bronze statue of William Goebel was commissioned, crafted by the skilled hands of sculptor Charles Henry Niehaus. The statue was designed to stand as a silent sentry near the very spot where Goebel fell. If you were to stand there tonight, you could almost feel the cold, heavy weight of the bronze. The metal has taken on a soft, seafoam green patina, a protective skin of oxidation earned through decades of standing against the driving rains and the humid summer heat of the bluegrass. The base of the monument is adorned with intricate egg and dart moldings and rosettes, and carved deep into the stone are the words that defined Goebel's short, turbulent reign. One side lists his legislative battles against the monopolies and the railroads, while the other bears a quote that still echoes through the valley. The question is, are the corporations the masters or the servants of the people? It is a pensive statue, his head slightly bowed as if he is listening to the secrets of the wind that whistles through the portico behind him. A second statue stands in the Frankfurt Cemetery, this one portraying Goebel as the fiery orator he was in life, with his fist raised toward the heavens as if still challenging the powers that be. But here, near the capital, the atmosphere is different. It is a place of profound stillness. The Kentucky River flows nearby, its waters dark and smooth like liquid obsidian, carrying the memories of the 1900s away toward the sea. The political soul of the state was forever altered by that single shot fired on a cold January morning. It left a scar, a reminder of how thin the veil is between order and chaos, but it also left a legacy of reform and a voice for the common man that refused to be silenced by a bullet. The identity of the actual assassin, the one whose finger really pulled the trigger, remains a secret kept by the earth and the stones of the old annex. Perhaps it was James Howard, perhaps it was Henry Utsi, or perhaps it was a nameless mountain man who vanished back into the mist of the Appalachians as soon as the deed was done. The truth has dissolved into the fog that frequently rolls off the river and blankets the town of Frankfort in a soft, white velvet. The anger has faded. The bitter rivalries have turned to dust. All that remains is the quiet dignity of the monument and the long, slow shadows of the trees as they stretch across the Capitol lawn at dusk. As we reach the end of our journey through these dark hallways of history, the sounds of the past begin to soften. The clatter of the horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestones, the shouting of the lawmakers, and the sharp crack of the rifle are all being replaced by the steady, peaceful rhythm of the night. The stories of William Goebel and his rivals are now just whispers in the archives, their faces frozen in yellowed photographs and bronze casts. You can feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders, replaced by the cool, comforting embrace of the present. The air around you is still and safe. The river continues its long, slow journey, and the hills of Kentucky sleep beneath a blanket of stars, just as they did over 100 years ago. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.